carved up on pizza and people begin falling asleep. Matter of fact, I was speaking about 2 weeks ago on George Washington's anniversary or birthday coming up, and there was an elderly gentleman in the back who had fallen asleep and his hearing aid had gone off. And the host of the event actually stopped the event to go and ask him to turn off his hearing aid because it was interfering with the PA system. So he woke up, turned off the hearing aid, and then went back to sleep. That doesn't bode well for my presentation today. The other thing is Dr. Elliott has set me up very graciously here by planting the sapling of liberty in Philadelphia, which I guess means that I'm supposed to supply the manure, you see. Let me tell you a little bit, I don't often talk about myself too much when I give presentations, but I've enjoyed meeting with people in the room from a couple of different schools, many of them not here locally. We've got some folks from the University of Dallas here, some friends from the University of St. Thomas, a couple from Baylor, and I always enjoy asking, what did you major in and why? And I got interested in government, sort of a geeky story, I guess, but when I was about 7 years old, it was actually May of 1977. And I remember that because my dad loaded me up in our orange VW van. We drove all the way into the big city to go to the big theater, which had 2 screens. That was before the Megaplex. And we went and saw this movie called Star Wars. And this is before all the hubbub had hit. But that's kind of a geeky story. But after the movie was over, he said, "What'd you think?" I said, "It was a great movie. I loved it." And talking about all the characters and that sort of thing. But I asked him, what's the difference between a republic and an empire? Because that's the premise of the whole struggle between the two and the rebellion. And he explained it to me. He says, if you like that sort of stuff, you ought to go look up stuff on the American Revolution. Because it's essentially the same sort of rebellion against the empire. So I got into all that stuff, checking out books from the library, and the more I learned about the American Revolution, the more and more I was continually referred to Roman history with the sort of the end of the republic and transition to an empire. So it sort of set me on a lifelong quest to sort of study government and to figure out why there are different forms of government. And throughout time, different forms of government seem more prevalent than others, and what makes one form of government better than the other. So when I was in college, I abandoned my plans to go to law school and become a high-powered, well-paid lobbyist, and decided instead to study political philosophy and serve mankind. At least that's what Plato tells me I'm supposed to do. Now the problem is that political philosophers don't always agree on how best we're supposed to serve mankind or go about building good governments. On the one side, there are people who believe that the values of society should inform the basis for that government. So it doesn't mean that these values are necessarily good. You can have political systems based on really horrible values. But the argument is that the first step in building a stable and lasting political society is to figure out what they embrace, their traditions, their history, their social mores, and you build on top of that. And that's an old idea that goes way back to Aristotle, who us political scientists refer to as the father of political scientists. The biologists claimed him for biology, but it was a mistake. You remember he ditched all that. On the other side is a very different approach of political philosophy to building good governments. One sort of put forward by Plato and Marx and Thomas More, though I'm never sure if he's kidding me or not. And this is the idea that you can change human nature, particularly if you have the right leaders with the right education and the proper intellectual abilities. And these folks believe that social and political values are merely artificial constructs, and they can be changed and re-administered depending on who's in power. Now the tension between these two sides, those who believe that political values matter and those who believe that they can be imposed anew from the outside, is really the tension between liberals and conservatives. That's the conflict at the heart of those differences. And Kirk tells us that our American political culture is fundamentally rooted in conservatism. And I don't mean like Eric Cantor or John Boehner conservatism, but conservatism in the truest sense of the word, that our political system is based on the preservation or the conservation of values and beliefs that have long been held dear to Americans' hearts since the founding and much earlier than that. And you've heard some of that in the presentations today. And this is what makes Philadelphia so important in our discussions. All these forces and ideas that we've already heard about from Athens and Rome and Jerusalem and London converge in the 18th century city of Philadelphia to birth a novus ordo seclorum, and a new order of the ages, but a new order grounded in old ideas. And this is what Kirk refers to as the roots of the American order. So what I want to do in our time today is to highlight Kirk's argument that our nation is not founded on revolutionary or new ideas, but rather the ideas our founding fathers fought for, or the principles that were held dear to them and the colonists before them and the countless generations of Englishmen before that. It was primarily a fight to conserve principles, not the creation of something new or radical. And it's this that allows me to tell my neighbors, you see, that I'm a conservationist at heart. That's good. So I think the best way to approach doing this is to look at our two sort of principal founding documents and the ideas in those documents to show you that there's really nothing new in the American founding. So if you could, in the Google Maps of your mind's eye, right, transition from London over to Philadelphia in the year 1776, when the Declaration of Independence is being issued. And the history here behind the Declaration is interesting. In June of 1776, as it looks like we're headed toward independency, as they called it, a resolution was brought forward by a Virginian named Richard Henry Lee. And a resolution is nothing more really than like an essay prompt you would have in your class, right? It gives you the impetus to debate a question. And so he introduces this resolution which says that these united colonies of and our right ought to be free and independent states. And that's the question that they will have to debate. Well, this takes back some of the other delegates at the Continental Congress. They're not sure they're authorized to make this sweeping decision on the behalf of their home states. So they ask for permission to go back to their home states, talk to their constituents and their state legislatures, and figure out what the official position on independency is from their home state. So they're going to adjourn for a couple of weeks. Well, in that period of adjournment, John Adams, who has been a big advocate for independency, you've read the book by David McCullough or seen the HBO miniseries, which is great, right? Asked for the opportunity to put together a little committee to draft up a declaration of principles in the event independence is voted on. And John Hancock says, well, that's fine, there's no objections, form your committee. So Adams chooses on that committee Ben Franklin, who lives there in Philadelphia, sort of the sage of America, John Livingston from New York, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, and this quiet redheaded Virginian who hardly says anything, sits on the side of the room doodling, staring out the window, named Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is important because he has a reputation for being a very good writer. He's already written some things in favor of American independence. He's from Virginia, so politically that changes sort of the debate from just being Massachusetts in the northeast to the south. And Adams famously says that I have built up a reputation in the Continental Congress of being despised and disliked, and you are very much thought of otherwise, right? So it's a good political decision. So Jefferson will disappear, and anytime like group work, as you know, when you've had in your classes, what always happens in group work is one person winds up doing all the work, right? And this is what happens to Thomas Jefferson. So for 2 weeks, he drafts up this Declaration of Independence, sort of in absentia. We don't really know what goes on. And Adams and Franklin show up 2 weeks later to look at the draft. We know they sort of edited and changed some things because we have their marked up copy in the National Archives. And it's presented before the Continental Congress. The debate for independence goes forward. They vote for independence on July 2nd, and John Adams is very thrilled about this. He writes to Abigail and says, July 2nd will go down in history as the epic of American independence, right? And then 2 days later, the Continental Congress takes Jefferson's declaration, reads it, tweaks it, affirms it, and passes it, and we now separate independence on July 4th, and Jefferson gets all the glory. And I've always felt sad for poor John Adams, who writes to Abigail and says, they will build monuments to Thomas Jefferson and nothing to me. And still to this day I ask, where is the monument to John Adams? And there is not one. So you can put that on the ISI list, you see. So how is this document, this Declaration of Independence, which we hold up as really this sort of this founding statement of American principles, how is it revolutionary? And it begins with the first paragraph, and we always make school kids memorize the second. You probably have to memorize it as well, or you should. But there's a paragraph before the second paragraph. And it begins, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another. Now the interesting thing is the language for a revolutionary document is pretty lame. Right? I mean, if this is truly revolution, I want something fiery. The first line should be that the children of America The sons of liberty will water the meadows of our nation with the blood of tyrants. Right? You would see that, you would find that in French, in the French Revolution, but not in the American Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, right? Jefferson sort of intentionally downplays this revolutionary element. It almost sounds more evolutionary than revolutionary. The idea that Jefferson putting forward is that this isn't something artificial, this break with the mother country. This is something altogether natural. It's not that we're doing something new. It's almost as if he's writing a Dear John letter to his spouse. And I know many of you here in college have gone through this process, right? Where you begin the letter by saying, it's not you, it's me. And these things happen. That's sort of the idea. Don't take it personally by laying it all out. So it doesn't have this sort of revolutionary rhetoric. What about the most famous part? Right? This idea that all men are created equal. Surely this is revolutionary. And this is what we tell little kids in school when we study the Declaration of Independence. The first time that we're going to put forward a government based on the premise that all men are equal. But it's not really meant as a social statement. Right? And those of you who have studied the Declaration and John Locke and Enlightenment theory sort of know this. It's really much more a philosophical or theological principle, not an empirical observation. And it can lead to all sorts of interesting discussions, maybe on another day, about moral versus social values. Now, as Christians, we believe that in the eyes of God, all men are created equal, and that way we have equal value in the eyes of our Creator. But in social terms, does the guy who sells snow cones at the corner of Fondren and Beechnut have the same social value as the physician over here curing pediatric cancer? And I'm not sure Jefferson meant to say that they were the same. It's not meant to be a revolutionary statement. Jefferson includes the principle because it's important to a larger philosophical and theological argument. And that is the concept of natural law, which also shows up in that first paragraph. Now, you guys know better than anybody what this concept of natural law, the laws of nature, is all about. It's this universal law that binds all men equally together. It sounds a little bit like the Force to me. You see, I harken back to an earlier day. It imposes a universal standard of justice, of right and wrong in all men, everywhere and at all times. No one is exempt, right? And no one can be treated unequally under the law. And that's where this equality comes about, that this natural standard of right and wrong that applies to everybody. Well, where did Jefferson get this idea? Most obviously it comes from Locke. Right? And a good civics lesson, which you've probably already done, is when you read the Declaration of Independence, is to get out Locke's second treatise and put them side by side and read them. And much of the verbiage is very similar. So much so that if you were to try to submit, I might do this, the Declaration of Independence and John Locke on Turnitin.com, I think Jefferson would fail. Right? The red light would come up, and we'd have to give him an F on his paper. Right? But it even goes back further than Locke. We see this in Thomas Aquinas. Right? Aquinas writes, "The natural law as to general principles is the same for all men, to avoid offending those among whom one has to live and to do them justice." Right? That's the idea. But the concept is even older than Aquinas. As Professor Elliott tells us, it comes back from Cicero, one of my favorite of the sort of ancients. And Cicero writes most eloquently that the directive of human beings implanted by nature and derives from the fundamental law that rules the rules of right and wrong. We cannot be freed from its obligation by our conscience, our senate, or our people. That's good. Right? And there are others as well, like this idea of natural law. Well, what about the most famous line? This idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where did he get that phrase? And isn't that particularly revolutionary? Well, no, it comes from Locke. He draws it from Locke. But Locke uses the phrase for life, liberty, and property. And all three of those elements are protected under the natural law. These are the things that no one else can take from you without your consent. You're entitled to these things by God. Your life, your natural-born liberty, and your property, which Locke says comes from your nature, your hard work, the things you work to achieve. So why does Jefferson change it to happiness? Well, both our previous speakers are right that the Founding Fathers, by and large, took much more from Roman history than Greek history. Right? With the exception that Jefferson had this fascination with Greek philosophy. And given what we know about Jefferson, that does not surprise me. Right? Jefferson is a big fan, particularly of Aristotle and Plato. And when you go back and you read the ancients, particularly Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle tells us pretty early on what the purpose of the polis is, right? The politics, the state, the city. And that purpose is to pursue the good, which he defines as the happiness of the people. Right? And says there's no reason you would live under a city-state, a polis, in a civil society if it made you less of a person or made you miserable. Although sometimes I feel like I'm trapped in that situation right now. But the idea is by expanding it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson is sort of invoking this ancient idea that governments are set up to better men. Not for better men, but to better mankind, right? For this pursuit of happiness. So that's the philosophical part of the Declaration. That's the part that most of us read and know by heart and cherish. And it really stands as sort of a timeless, universal set of principles that could be applied at any place in time, sort of echoing this profound nature of the natural law. As a matter of fact, last February, when the college students of Egypt were having this revolution against Mubarak in Egypt, they issued online a statement of the principles of man for the Egyptians. And you can pull it up. It reads about 80% stolen from our Declaration of Independence, almost verbatim, that those principles still stand. And that tells me something. Now, there's a second part of the Declaration of Independence we typically ignore because it's a little dry. And it's the list of grievances against the king. And those grievances are not new either. Neither the content nor the form is novel to the Declaration of Independence. They draw both the form and the content from a long history of legal petitioning for people in government. It goes all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215, the Petition of Right in 1623, and the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And if you take the English Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and our current and the Bill of Rights, our current one of the Constitution, and you lay them side by side, you'll see a lot of similarity there. That form of when you had a grievance against the king or the government, what you would do is you would start with some philosophical statement as to what the nature of the grievance was and why it was bad, and then you would later list out the specific instances of abuse that you wanted addressed. And you can see that in the English Bill of Rights, for instance. There's a whole series of these in English history. The form of the Declaration would have been intimately familiar with every Englishman and colonist during that period of time. It was the way you spoke truth to power by following that legal course of petitioning. And it's one of the reasons that one of our protections in the Bill of Rights is the right to petition the government. Right? So they can't take that and then follow you and chop your head off or your hands and tack them to a podium later when they're angry. The content is not new. The grievances in the Declaration of Independence are grievances that they go back to in reference to the Bill of Rights. They believe their rights as Englishmen are being violated. And listen to the things that come from the English Bill of Rights in 1689 compared to what we see in the Declaration and what we hear about in our own Bill of Rights. Here are a few of the things they list. That the king has imposed excessive fines upon us. That there are illegal and cruel punishments inflicted. Right? These are from the Bill of Rights in 1689. He has suspended trials, obstructed justice, tampered with the judiciary, quartered soldiers among us, denied us the right to bear arms. All these things sound familiar. This isn't new material. This is old material. And so the point is, when you look closely at the Declaration, it's clear that not much of it is original. Jefferson turns to old ideas for a new cause. And so Kirk's point is that the American Revolution was not revolutionary at all. It was a return to ideas long held in high esteem by the British colonists, not a rejection of fundamental assumptions about politics, not trying to remake the world anew, but fighting to conserve something ancient that was being threatened. It was a true revolution, only in the sense that it was a 360-degree turn back to first principles. So we can move from 1776 to 1787, a little over a decade later, and the forces of history again converge on Philadelphia if they ever left. And here we find 55 men from 12 states, because you remember Rhode Island has a history of being stubborn. They didn't send anybody. And these men arrive in Philadelphia to construct a government designed to preserve the liberty of Americans, and yet allow enough efficiency and energy in government to provide that necessary order, that tension between liberty and order we always talk about. And for 3.5 months in Philadelphia, if you've ever been to Philadelphia, the climate is not much different in the summer than it is here in Houston, right? It is hot, it is humid, there would have been no air conditioning in that time period. The men wear these wool coats with these powdered wigs. It must have been miserable. And they had the windows sealed up for secrecy. And I've always thought that if I were born in that time period and had the good fortune to have been invited to the convention and make my mark on history, I would have left because of the heat and humidity. So it's a good thing we have air conditioning today, you see. But these men come to Philadelphia and they stick it out for 3.5 months to try to design what has become really one of the great achievements of Western civilization, that is our Constitution. Now, there's this mythology we teach school kids, that these men come to Philadelphia and the reason they stay there 3.5 months is because they're designing all this from scratch, right? And they're trying to figure it out anew. And at the end when they walk out, they say, aha! We have created this new government of the people, by the people, and for the people, mixing Lincoln with the founders, right? It's all myth. The reality is the reason it took them so long when they showed up there is it's like going to an academic conference and getting people to agree on whether there are 10 or 6 or 7 principles. The founders knew too much. And they drew primarily from these 5 cities that Russell Kirk is talking about here. They drew from Greece and from Rome, as Dr. Stacy and Dr. Elliott tell us about. And from the ancients, they got political theory and historical lessons. From theory, for instance, we heard about Aristotle and his politics. Aristotle tells us, if you remember, that there are basically 3 forms of government, still true today. Government of the one, government of the few, and government of the many. That's a nice way to think about it. And all these have strengths, but all of these forms also has terrible disadvantages. And the only real way, Aristotle says, to where you don't wind up with sort of a dangerous, degenerate form of government is to mix them all together in a hybrid so that the worst elements sort of wash out with the better elements. And from that, we get sort of a mixed form of government, a monarchy in the presidency to some extent, an aristocracy like the Roman Senate and our Senate, which is where the name was chosen from, and then in the House of Representatives, sort of like the tribunes, the assemblies of the people. The mixed government is really the best form. From history they took from the Greeks and Romans, Dr. Stacy is exactly right. They were less inclined to look at the Greeks as a positive role model for doing anything. Right? The Greek assembly, the Greek democracy was really looked at in a pejorative sense, in the sense that this is what we do not want to become. And when you read the writings of the founding fathers, the only time you see the word democracy is like in a negative reference. Like this is what happens when you have democracy. Right? Or else the way I like to phrase it, the problem with democracy, you see, is it's government by the people. And the people shop at Walmart. I don't know what that means, but it just sounds good to add that on the end. Right? And for some of the classic examples, my favorite story of Greek democracy gone bad. When they're fighting the Spartans during the Peloponnesian War, the Battle of Arginusa, the Athenians and their powerful navies defeat the Spartans, who are not good seafaring warriors, right? They're more land-based warriors. And it's a rout. But this terrible storm blows in, and the Athenian generals have to rally their fleet and sail back to Athens as quickly as they can. And when they get back, they're feted and celebrated for having defeated the Spartans and destroyed the Spartan navy. And then it comes out that because of the storm, however, and the haste with which they fled, they had to leave a lot of their sailors behind, who were then captured by the Spartans and killed. Or some men who were adrift on floating ships were merely abandoned or to drown at sea. And the Athenian assembly is so outraged at the death of their loved ones, their neighbors, right, that they hold these generals in trial and then convict them of negligence and execute all 5 who had just liberated them from a Spartan attack. The only man in the Athenian assembly to vote against this was Socrates, which started his great unpopularity among the Athenians, right? But that's the idea the founding fathers would say is this is what happens when you give people power. They do crazy things. And if you've seen people try to get into Walmart to buy the Tickle Me Elmo on Christmas Day, on Christmas Eve, you know what I'm talking about. From the Romans, they took sort of the benefits of a mixed form of government, but also the tensions between the optimates and the popularities, right? The wealthy people and the working class, so this is the masses. And the rivalries that would grow up among demagogues who could sort of use their positions in society to gain power. And particularly the dangers of people like Julius Caesar, who could come to power by sort of building support and loyalty from the masses by giving them things. And eventually the great fall of the Roman Republic. That was the lesson the founders really wanted to learn is, we're trying to move from an empire to a republic. What went wrong with the Romans where they moved from a republic to the empire so we can avoid those mistakes? From Jerusalem, they got the very important idea of covenant theology. This is an area that doesn't get discussed much, but it's really fundamental to our form of government. I mean, what is a covenant? A covenant is more than a pact or a promise. It is an oath that we take with God. And the covenant is damning in the sense that if you fail to uphold it, your soul is in jeopardy. So this is a very serious thing, this covenant. Well, our early pilgrim forefathers, when they came to this country, when they're sailing from England, it's an interesting backstory. Pilgrims are not wealthy people. They're not known for their great business sense. Right? They go to Holland for a while and flail around there trying to make a buck and realize they can't cut it. So they come back to England to raise some money to get to the New World. And one of the ways they raise money is by selling the empty seats on the Mayflower to people who just want to get out of London and get to the New World. Many of these people are debtors, who it's cheaper to buy a ticket than pay your debt. Right? Many of these people have former convictions. They've been branded with a T on their thumb for thief or something like that, and they want to get out of England because they can't get jobs. Many of these people just have no future. Maybe they're the second sons. They will get no inheritance from their fathers. They're looking for a new start. So they sell these empty seats and they travel across the ocean. Well, this is a whole month voyage where there's some strife and tension between the pilgrims, these religious refugees, and these sort of adventurers, these scallywags trying to get to the New World. And as soon as they get to sort of the edge of the virgin wilderness of North America and they look across at the land, these pilgrim fathers, clutching their wives and children, look across at these young men who I'm sure now have crazy beards and stink and are kind of going crazy, and realize that we could have a real problem when we hit shore. We have no code of laws. These guys are already talking about going their own way and finding their own fortunes. We might wind up like Jamestown in total dissolution, because they knew the story of Jamestown. This is a decade afterwards. And so all the men on the ship get together in the hull and draft up a little compact, we call it, the Mayflower Compact, which political scientists and historians consider our first real step on the road to constitutionalism. All the men sign their name on this compact, which bears the name of the ship, and pledge to each other to abide by the will of the majority before they get off the boat. They have no form of government, but we will abide by the will of the majority. Now these men could have just signed that and then gotten off the boat and said, to heck with you and your stupid compact, I'm doing what I want. Except for one thing. The very opening lines of that compact are, in the name of God, amen. In essence, you have made a pact not only amongst ourselves, but a covenant with God to uphold this agreement. Now the reason that's important is it starts this uniquely American tradition of writing down our fundamental political compacts and agreements and holding them sacred. So much so that even though our Constitution is merely a piece of paper, and you could rip it up and the country could go on based on those principles, we keep the original in a helium-filled, blast-proof box that goes down in the National Archives every night 80 feet, and it's sealed by blast doors, and 2 armed Marines stand on top of it until the next morning when the sun comes up and they raise it back up. As if that the piece of paper itself were to be destroyed, the country would fall. And that's the sort of lasting lesson we get from the pilgrims, that this covenant we've made with ourselves, with the past, and with the future is really enshrined in this piece of paper. So much so that some scholars and historians have referred to it as American scripture. I think that's sort of a nice reference. From the medieval world, we also take our conceptions of natural law, sort of blending of the old, the ancient, and the new. That there's a higher good than just what the regime dictates. Remember, a written constitution is just a piece of paper. There are many countries in the world that have written constitutions, China and Iran, for instance. Right? You can have a constitution that says, I am the king, and you should do everything I say and be obeyed. In short, you can have a constitution that can be a mechanism for something really bad, unless you believe in a higher good. And largely from this medieval world, we find our strongest proponents of the natural law, people like Thomas Aquinas. And it's really this natural law idea, which we've already seen in our Declaration of Independence, that makes constitutionalism, our belief in limited government, possible. Because the natural law says there are certain things that no man, and that's the ancient conception, no man can do, even if he's in government. Right? Our life, our liberty, our happiness or property are protected even from the written law, because the natural law is higher. Well, the founding fathers, of course, were Englishmen before they declared independence. And they draw quite a bit from the city of London. We've heard a little bit about that before as well. But particularly their legal traditions and history, their understanding of law, is drawn from their colonial, their English heritage. And Kirk particularly singles out and mentions Blackstone, Hume, and Burke. Blackstone was really the basis for our understanding of law as a process, right? But one rooted in natural law with the objective of protecting citizens and achieving justice, rather than merely dispensing the order for the ruling regime. The law, according to Blackstone, is not merely a tool for the benefit of the people in power. It has a duty to a higher cause. And Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England was really the primary means of legal education during the founding and for 100 years afterwards, and is still cited in court cases today. Matter of fact, I read recently that the Supreme Court, on average, cites Blackstone 7 to 12 times every year. So he sort of has a sort of a lasting impact. David Hume, they took the idea that our collective experiences and our history as a people, our values, define who we are and inform our political culture. And that our government should seek to protect these values, not undermine or overturn them, so that the ancient customs of society form the bedrock of a stable political system. And because of this, Hume argued that revolutions should be very moderate in temper in order to protect the political system from irreparable damage, something that the French would not understand or learn. No wonder Jefferson hated Hume so much, right? Tried to actually have Hume's reading banned from the University of Virginia. And Edmund Burke, our advocate during the Revolution, he understood probably better than anybody else in England what the Americans were fighting for. We were fighting for liberty. This wasn't a new idea to the English. Burke understood that. And in 1775, when he's advocating for the Americans, or at least trying to create sympathy for us Americans in the British Parliament, he gives a famous speech, very long because they didn't have anything to do back in those days but give long speeches. But Burke argues, he says famously, that the people of the colonies are descendants of Englishmen. That's probably the way he sounded. They are therefore not only devoted to liberty, but to liberty according to English ideas and on English principles. Leave them to their liberty, he would say, and they will turn their faces towards you, or something like that. The idea. There's one element we often neglect as our founders turn toward these other cities. They also turn toward their own early American experience, particularly the colonies and early statehood. And remember, since about early 1600s, all the colonies that were here existed under colonial charters. And these colonial charters were really sort of very basic constitutions in some ways. They laid out a form of government, they laid out processes of government, they laid out sort of basic liberties and rights, and these could be tinkered with and sort of varied from state to state, from colony to colony. It was almost like a little experiment in early sort of constitutional design. The very earliest of these sort of prototypical constitutions, political scientists and historians consider the first American Constitution to be the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, written in 1639. Right? And it lays out some very American principles, things like federalism, a representative assembly, the idea of veto and overturning vetoes and those sort of things. Right? In Massachusetts in 1641, we get what might be sort of considered our first sort of Bill of Rights, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. And it's a surprisingly progressive document. In addition to all the basic liberties of Englishmen, the right to bear arms and freedom of conscience and property, there are also, for instance, rights of women to divorce abusive husbands, the rights of children to sue for inheritance, the rights of young women who have been denied marriage by their parents to seek marriage on their own, the rights of abused children to seek legal separation from their parents. Hillary Clinton liked that idea, you see. And even animal rights in there. Apparently Massachusetts liberalism goes way back, right, to the long-standing tradition. But the Founding Fathers also drew on early state constitutions. And this is a part of the story that's near and dear to my heart, but is often forgotten. Right, we often teach this mythology that when the Founding Fathers got together in 1787 to draft the Constitution, this was a new idea altogether. But the reality is, in May of 1776, as we're headed toward independence, the Continental Congress issues a decree to the 13 states telling them to prepare for the eventuality of statehood, and they should begin drafting state constitutions. And one of the reasons that John Adams and Jefferson actually have very little to do with the Constitution in addition to serving as ambassadors abroad, is they were spending most of their time working on their state constitution back home, because to them that was their country, right? That's what they really thought of in terms of their homes. But by 1787, we have lived under constitutionalism for a dozen years. Every state in the Union has had a constitution. But the oldest constitution in the world, and this is a trivial pursuit question, which is wrong. I have written the editors twice, but apparently they no longer want to hear from me. There is a question that says, what is the oldest written constitution in the world? And you flip the card and the answer says the U.S. Constitution, and that is incorrect. The oldest written constitution in the world that's still in effect is the Massachusetts State Constitution, which went into effect in 1776. Right? It is still the same constitution. It's never been replaced. But I guess they don't want to hear that. It just confuses the game. So they have all these state constitutions to draw from. And so when they arrive in Philadelphia, they're not there to create things like an executive branch or a legislature and bicameralism and a judiciary. They're not spending time thinking this stuff up from scratch. The reality is they already have preconceptions as to what they want what the new Constitution should look like. And the problem is they all want it to look like the state constitution back home. And that's what they're bickering about. So even things like the Connecticut Compromise, which we teach as Roger Sherman coming up with this brilliant solution, they had been doing this for a decade. It's just that they thought people had different ideas as to what should go on. So the reason they spent so much time in Philadelphia arguing over the design of the proposed national constitution was not because they knew too little, but because they knew too much, you see. And the point of all this is to show that nothing in the American founding is really found. It was all old and borrowed. And the roots of the American order run deep. And Philadelphia is really an amalgam of what all these other cities wrought before it. Philadelphia is where the warp and the woof of history coalesce to form the cloth of our founding documents. So why is all this important? And I'll be happy to take your questions. Kirk tells us that this American order is basically a culture. Right? It's a political culture, like I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And like any culture, one based on language or tradition or food or religion, it has to be preserved and passed down, or else it will cease to exist. And that's why groups like ISI and places like HBU and people like you are so important to this American experiment. It's an experiment that picks and chooses the greatest ideas of human history regarding human happiness and development, to see if people really can govern themselves by reflection and choice, or if we remain forever doomed to rely on accident and force for our means of government. Now, I'm always reminded of Edward Gibbon, right, the great chronicler of Roman history who wrote during the 18th century, and the founders loved Edward Gibbon. It's this voluminous history of the Roman Republic, and it's hard to get through because of the writing style. But after his analysis of why the Roman Republic fell and the Roman Empire ceased to be, he ends his magnum with this. He says, the Romans fell because they forgot themselves and they ceased to be Roman. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to take your questions.